Greetings, everyone. A huge welcome to our global viewers from the Middle East Policy Council located in Washington, D.C. My name is Besima El-Hussein, and I am the Executive Director. The conversation today is our 9th in our monthly journal Contributor Dialogue series. This series offers U.S. policymakers short video discussions on timely issues related to foreign policy matters in the Middle East. Our contributor dialogues leverage the subject matter expertise and geographic diversity of contributors to our world-renowned journal, Middle East Policy. If you'd like to learn more about our journal and how to subscribe, you can do so on our website, www.mepc.org. We look forward to a very thought-provoking discussion today with John Hoffman regarding his essay, Great Power Competition in the Middle East, that was recently published in our journal, Middle East Policy. Mr. Hoffman is a doctoral candidate in political science at George Mason University, focusing on Middle East geopolitics and political Islam. He has published extensively on the Middle East in academic platforms, including Middle East Policy, the Digest of Middle East Studies, Durham Middle East Papers, as well as and also policy-oriented platforms, including Foreign Policy Magazine and the Washington Post. A huge welcome to Mr. Hoffman. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Besima.
So first and foremost, for our viewers who have not yet had the chance to read your very in-depth article on changing dynamics in the Middle East, could you please give them a rough outline of your argument and the main points?
Sure. So really the original drive behind the paper came from the fact that a majority of analyses looking at the return of great power competition to the Middle East were really one-sided. They approach the issue exogenously, examining how the Middle East fits into broader great power rivalry between the United States, Russia, and China. But this approach, viewing great power competition through the lens of a more patron-client relationship, is rather limited. So I wanted to flip it around. I wanted to see what the return of great power competition means for states within the Middle East, namely those within the US camp.
Okay, so right. And then you refer to those as CRB, I believe, right? The counter-revolutionary bloc. Can you please define what that is for our audience and which countries you consider to be part of that bloc?
Sure. So the way I tried to separate it conceptually was after the uprisings, there were kind of three ad hoc blocks, I call them. One was the counter-revolutionary bloc, which is Saudi Arabia, the UAE, post-2013 Egypt, and Israel. And these are the actors who wanted to maintain the existing regional status quo and balance of power and crush the Arab uprisings. Mm-hmm. Then there was a separate bloc, if you will, of Qatar and Turkey, both of whom sought to support select elements of the uprisings in order to advance their own geostrategic positions, but still underneath the broader umbrella of the US maintained security order. And then a third camp of Iran, and to a lesser degree, Syria, just because it was so immediately internally consumed. But of course, these blocs were never straight-cut coalitions, never formal alliances or anything like that. There was cross-bloc cooperation, intra-bloc variation. Certainly during the later years of Obama, and especially under the Trump administration, you could see the sorting of these blocs more clearly. But these lines are much more blurred now following the entrance of Joe Biden into the presidency, the official ending of the blockade of Qatar, and more surface level reconciliation across the region that you're seeing.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, because in your paper you argue that there were two primary causes to these new geopolitical associations, and I believe you argued that the Arab Spring was one primary cause, and then the subsequent conflicts that ensued. I also thought it was interesting, the Iran deal also seems to be a very polarizing issue when it comes to the Middle East. And I was also struck by the fact that when these blocs were being formed, or casually being formed, informally being formed, that there was so much there were stronger overtones of partisanship in these I don't want to say client states, but of the US, but certainly US camp states, that we had never really seen to that extent before. And I'm wondering kind of what your thoughts are on that, and how that plays into the tempering of it now in the Biden administration.
Yeah, so I think, when Obama entered into the JCPOA, it, really angered U.S. partners in the region. I mean, it was shown with Netanyahu coming and talking before Congress. And I think what that did was it kind of, I don't want to say outright challenged the quote unquote blank check that's typically given to a lot of U.S. partners in the region, but it showed them that the United States won't always toe the line that regional partners really want them to. Now, of course, it was completely overhauled when Trump came into office, and now Biden is trying to get back into it, and you see some resistance to it. But I think with the Iran deal in particular, I think most in Washington have come to the realization that abandoning the deal was a mistake. It's much easier to work, even given the deal's flaws. I think many in Washington are saying we'd rather have some deal than absolutely nothing. And I think they're kind of abrogating the objections of like Saudi Arabia or Israel to try to return to some sort of agreement.
Okay, thank you. I was wondering your thoughts because I was very much, the CRB certainly had a very kind of unified response to that issue. So my next question is, how do you think the American people or American government leadership will or has been reacting essentially to the increasing role of Russia and China in the region? Do you think that Americans could potentially pressure the CRB to divest from their partnerships with Russia and China? What is the status of that situation now?
So what I see at least is, for the United States, I think the official American reaction has been one of mostly displeasure, but this is on a pretty strictly rhetorical level. There have been cases, and I cite a few in the piece, where Washington has pushed specific partners on specific engagements with Russia and China. But much of this is still playing out just purely in the discourse level. As opposed to tangible policy changes. Washington currently, in over the past couple of years, but also with Joe Biden, appears to be more interested in doubling down on their commitments to regional partners as a form of reassurance, rather than pressuring them or really stepping away from these relationships in any way.
Okay. And then in light of the most recent events, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, how do you think the great power dynamic in the Middle East is being impacted by that, or how do you see it potentially going?
So I think, and this was a big part of the paper where I stressed limitations of Russia and China in the region. And I think Ukraine has highlighted this. I don't think Russia's invasion of Ukraine has altered the great power dynamic in the Middle East, but I do think it has served to highlight some fundamental problems in U.S. Middle East policy. So first, on Russia and China in the Middle East, Moscow and Beijing, and I stress this in the paper, they have not outright challenged the U.S.-led security order in the region because they largely benefit from it. It's provided the security umbrella for them to become more involved in the region without having to directly assume the costs of physically protecting their interests. Russia and China, I would argue, are opportunists in the Middle East. They're not revisionists. Neither of them are capable or willing to construct and uphold a new political and security order in the region. As the American experience in the Middle East has shown, a regional order upheld by an external hegemon requires an enormous amount of political, economic, and military resources. And this is at a time when Russia and China are facing considerable economic troubles at home, especially Moscow now after its disastrous invasion of Ukraine. But Moscow and Beijing are also undermined by the very authoritarian nature of their own governments needing to use such a vast amount of resources to policing the state internally in order to maintain their own authority. And one of the main points that I make in the piece is that regional states are well aware of the limitations facing Russia and China. They do not view Moscow or Beijing as viable alternatives to Washington. And that's why, the main thesis of the paper was, instead of, turning to Russia and China, they view the region views the return of great power competition as a way to manipulate the return of great power rivalry, which is nothing new to the Middle East, in order to advance their own strategic objectives.
And can you give some examples to our audience of how these different countries or blocs have kind of exploited the increase in great power competition in the region?
Sure. So I think the best way to frame it would be that America's partners in the region have sought to, first and foremost, manipulate Washington's anxiety about losing its position relative to Russia or China, resulting in this type of reverse leverage. And what I think is most fascinating is, for these regional actors, their strategy of what I refer to in there as Omni alignment is not my concept; it's an academic concept. But through these strategies, they've been rather successful. They have been able to work with Russia and China on a number of opportunities while simultaneously pressuring Washington to do more. For example, there's been cooperation between Russia and China, or Russia and the UAE over Syria. The UAE funds Russian mercenaries in Libya. Israel, too, views the relationship with Russia as a way to try and counter Iranian influence in Syria. And there are several examples that I cite in the piece. A lot of countries in the region have turned to Russia and China when the United States has refused to sell them certain weapons technologies, certain nuclear technologies, civilian use nuclear technologies, and things like that. And what was so interesting, and I think the section is called "The Hegemon Responds" in the region. Trump did reverse a lot of the policies of his predecessors by pushing through these weapons, pushing through these technologies, despite objections.
Excellent, thank you. Do you foresee that Russia and China potentially being pressured into involvement in regional conflicts? You mentioned that they were relatively absent in the past. Do you see them potentially now, because they have more of an interest, that they could potentially become more involved? And if so, how would that impact the alignment dynamics?
So I personally, and of course there's a lot of differing opinions, but I personally don't see Russia and China getting more involved in regional conflicts. One, for the reason that we just previously discussed, they're opportunists in the region. They're not revisionists, and they've sought to maneuver underneath the US-led security order in order to advance interests here and there, but they could never assume the direct costs of getting so much more deeply engaged in the region like the United States is. And one of the points that I really mentioned in the paper is that much of the gains Russia and China have made in the Middle East are because they've compartmentalized their regional policies by refusing to take sides in many of the region's greatest geopolitical conflicts. So they actively engaged both sides of the Israel-Palestine conflict. They actively engaged both sides of the 2017 Gulf crisis, the Saudi Arabia-Iran rivalry. And Russia and China compartmentalize their policies in such a way in order to avoid being dragged into these disputes. And their actions in the region are much more in line with the concept of strategic hedging. And this hedging is only possible because the United States continues to uphold the prevailing regional order underneath which Moscow and Beijing are able to expand their regional footprints without assuming any direct costs.
Okay. And how are non-CRB countries, like, for example, Iran, Qatar, and Turkey, how do you see them currently reacting to the regional multipolarity?
So to begin with, Iran, I think that's the most straightforward one. You know, it's pretty clear why they would value increased relationships with other great powers, considering that Tehran resides outside of the region's hegemonic order and is opposed to it. Therefore, they've turned to America's competitors. And these relationships also help them skirt around the pressures of sanctions from the West. But both Qatar and Turkey, they are also both parts of the American hegemonic order in the region. And though there have been tensions over the past decade over different issues, such as Turkey's democratic backsliding and more regional assertiveness, the blockades launched against Qatar during the Gulf crisis, these two actors have attempted to increase their relative, and the fact that these two actors have sought to increase their relative positions vis-a-vis other actors underneath the U.S. security umbrella following the uprisings, they nevertheless depend on the U.S.-led regional order as well. And both of them have used relationships with Russia and China as a way to assert themselves on a more global scale. I think the Ukrainian piece here is pretty telling. Look at the gas deal between Qatar and Germany, Turkey's attempts to insert itself into the Ukrainian mediation efforts. They've also used outreach for investment. China has invested heavily in Turkey, but also as a way to pressure the U.S. And look at Turkey's recent comments about Washington first needing to deliver the F-35s to Ankara before it pressures Turkey into trying to deploy the S-400s into Ukraine. So they're doing the same thing.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so you talk about these concepts, multipolarity and omni alignment. I think it would be good for the audience if you kind of define what you mean by omni alignment. And then I'd like you to expand on whether or not you think these two elements can further exacerbate regional conflicts or potentially facilitate cooperation. Do you think there's a positive impact or a negative impact, in your opinion?
So omni alignment is a reworked version of Stephen David's omni balancing. So omni balancing was just the idea that states, particularly, he referred to them as third world states, but that states balance not only against external threats, but against internal threats. And omni alignment was a slight reworking of that concept, saying that states balance against interrelated threats, which are threats that feed off of both the domestic and the external. And that's what I argue the Arab uprisings represented, because it represented not only a threat to these regimes internally, whether their own people would rise, but it was a threat to the broader regional order. And these two threats kind of fed off of one another. So that's where the concept of omni alignment comes in, saying that these governments wanted to balance against this region-wide mass mobilization that threatened not only the broader regional order, but threatened them at home as well. And to get to the second part of your question, I think there are two parts to it. I think in the current state, the omni alignment of these different actors, this is just my opinion, have been destabilizing for the region and its people, but beneficial from the standpoint of these governments pursuing such policies. So in the broader region, I talk about it a bit in the paper, many actors in the region have turned towards Russia and China, especially as a way in helping to maintain the broader regional authoritarian status quo. Moscow and Beijing view the spread of democracy as anathema to their own interests, as do autocrats in the region. There's widespread cooperation between, especially members of the CRB, in Russia and China, on maintaining, kind of a strongman presence in the Middle East. And there's also cooperation between these countries, such as Egypt, Saudi, and the UAE, and China over issues in their own countries, such as the Uyghurs, namely deporting and detaining Uyghur exiles. So for the region, I think it's been destabilizing, but for these leaders, it's worked out quite well. Not just because Russia and China share a counter-revolutionary ethos with these governments, but because the return of global multipolarity, more than one great power in the system, has served as a great mechanism through which to pressure their primary security guarantor, the United States, into doing more. And we really saw this with the Trump administration, where these partners have been very successful in pressuring the US into granting them various policy concessions.
So my next question for you is, I was a little bit surprised actually when I read that you included Israel as part of the CRB, because, Israel argues that it is a democracy. So I was wondering if you could explain how or why Israel would have been anti essentially Arab Spring, or how that was posed a threat to them.
Sure. And this concept I don't really detail in the paper. It's a previous academic paper that I did with Durham, and I've done a few policy pieces touching on it. But at the heart of this, Israel has a vested interest in maintaining the regional authoritarian status quo in the Middle East. And there's a few reasons for this. One is a more strategic region of them keeping their stranglehold over Palestine. If popular sentiment in the Middle East is still incredibly pro-Palestinian. The Abraham Accords are high-level normalizations. These do not take into consideration the thoughts and the feelings and the desires of the people. If genuine democracies were to emerge in the Middle East, you would likely see much more pressure coming from these countries for a genuine settlement to the Israel-Palestine issue. So Israel views its ability to work with these authoritarian governments as the best way to maintain their own control over the Palestinian territories. Then there's the more normative aspect to it too. Israel presents itself as a beacon in a dark region, or a shining light on a hill, surrounded by hostile forces and a bad neighborhood, as they've referred to it before. This narrative would largely disappear if genuine democracies were to emerge in the Middle East. And the United States, Israel presents itself to the United States as really the only actor capable of advancing its interests, because it presents itself as a Western country with shared values of the United States. And if genuine democracies were to emerge in the Middle East, they might appear as, rather appealing allies in the region, and it would kind of damage Israel's narrative that it's beset in a region of hostility, despite the fact that Israel has a commanding military advantage over any country in the Middle East.
Right. Okay. And then can you explain how, I guess, they're able to kind of maintain that narrative in light of, the Abraham Accords? Because on one hand, they're, totally normalizing, so that doesn't help I guess, the narrative that they're in such a bad neighborhood.
Mhm. So with the Abraham Accords, it's important to recognize that the Abraham Accords are high level, top down normalizations that really serve to sideline not only the plight of the Palestinians, but popular Arab discourse as well. And the Abraham Accords, and I talk about it in the paper a bit, though this was not the main driver of the Abraham Accords, it's very interesting to view the Abraham Accords through the lens of great power competition. Yasmin Farouk at the Carnegie Endowment has done some really great work on this, talking about how the United States, as it seeks to pivot away from the Middle East to face threats primarily in the Asia Pacific, but now Eastern Europe after Russia's invasion, how the United States seeks to create a more formalized coalition through which to advance its interests. And, U.S. Middle East policy has really been rooted in two fundamental pillars for decades. One is unwavering support for the state of Israel. And the second is staunch support for select regional autocrats who they view as the best advancers of their interests. So the Abraham Accords, in my opinion, of course, there's millions of opinions, was an attempt to more formally merge these two undergirding pillars of U.S. Middle East policy as the U.S. tries to offshore its regional burden.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for those insights. So in general, you're touching on these changing dynamics in the Middle East, the increasing multipolarity and how the countries in the Middle East are now being able to kind of exploit it to pursue their own interests. So just for the viewers who haven't yet had a chance to read it, I'd like it if you could give just a couple examples quickly of how each country is doing that, and then what you think, if there are any, policy implications for the US. What does this mean for us?
Sure. So I think there's a few examples that I talk of in the piece. The United States was traditionally reluctant to supply certain drone technology, was reluctant to supply the F-35s to the UAE or to any partner in the region. But under Trump, what we saw was really a number of overtures to these countries, beginning with Israel, recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, saying that the West Bank settlements no longer violate international law, moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, and putting forth the quote unquote deal of the century. With Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE, we saw a slew of weapons packages, Trump declaring a national emergency to push through the $8 billion weapons package to these countries. We saw Trump providing them with the Patriot defense systems in Saudi Arabia. We saw the Trump administration pushing through nuclear technology or signing off on the provision of civilian nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia, even in the direct aftermath of the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. And I think going back to a earlier point that we were talking about, I think the crisis in Ukraine most recently is the most fascinating, because Russia's invasion of Ukraine is arguably the most significant conflict thus far in the newest era of great power competition. And I think this has really raised the question of whether these partnerships have indeed provided the United States with a, quote, comparative advantage, to use Brett McGurk's term. I think it should bring to the forefront the actions of certain U.S. partners after Ukraine. I think it should bring to the forefront questions about the massive amounts of resources we devote to the region, under the assumption that these partnerships advance U.S. interests, particularly as the United States is strapped for resources in this new era of great power competition.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, that brings us to our close. So I encourage everybody to check out the full article. It will be available for free. We will share it on social media. And please go to our website, www.mepc.org, to figure out how you can subscribe to our journal. Thank you so much, John, for joining us for this great conversation. And I hope everybody has a wonderful day.